You know the saying, heavy is the head that wears the crown, but what happens when that heaviness starts to, well, warp the mind? When the unbelievable power of a monarch takes their personal flaws, their strange quirks, and their darkest desires, and just amplifies them into stuff that becomes the stuff of legend, that's what we're diving into.
We're looking at what happens when the most powerful people on the planet just let their freak flags fly. I mean, when there's literally no one around to tell you no, things can get bizarre fast. And history, well, it gets a whole lot more interesting. We're talking about stories so strange, you're going to have a hard time believing they're not fiction.
First up, we're going to meet a ruler who was so consumed by rage that when a storm ruined his plans, he didn't just get mad. Oh no, he ordered the ocean itself to be punished with 300 lashes. Yes, you heard that right.
And then, get this, there's the story of a king whose love for his toy soldiers was so intense that when a literal rat, chewed through one of his favorites, he gave the little guy a full military court-martial right before its public execution.
And we're going to end with a story that is equal parts tragic romance and straight-up gothic horror. It's about a prince so destroyed by the murder of his secret love that when he finally became king, he had her body dug up from the grave and forced his entire court to bow down and kiss the hand of their dead queen.
All right, let's kick things off with a monarch whose whole life was pretty much dedicated to pleasure. A man who looked at the super-stripped, stuffy era named after his own mother and decided to turn it into his personal playground.
Queen Victoria. Yeah, just saying the name makes you think of a world of uptight morals and, constantly being in mourning. But her son and heir, Edward VII, or Bertie as everyone called him, was the absolute opposite. He was the original Playboy prince, a guy whose appetites were legendary and whose scandals would make today's tabloids just blush. And the scale of this was just staggering. This wasn't a few quiet affairs on the side. Bertie had his own private room at a famous Parisian brothel, complete with a custom-made tub shaped like a swan that he'd fill with champagne and women. He even commissioned a special love chair specifically designed to accommodate his large size and multiple partners at once. He was so brazen, he even gave his favorite mistresses their own special seating at his coronation.
His lifestyle was so wild that when a modern historian, Richard Thompson, was studying the designs for that love chair, with all its fancy seats and bronze stirrups, all he could say was, goodness knows how it was to be used. Yeah, I think we can probably venture a few guesses.
Okay, so from wild personal vices, we're going to pivot to something a lot darker: dynastic tragedy. For centuries, one of Europe's most powerful families, the Habsburgs, tried to keep their power pure by keeping their bloodlines pure. The result was an absolute genetic catastrophe that brought an empire to its knees.
Now, the most obvious sign of this problem was a physical trait that became infamous: the Habsburg jaw. See, to keep all their power and political alliances in the family, the Habsburgs just kept marrying within the family, uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins for almost 200 years. This concentrated all the bad genes, leading to a whole bunch of deformities, with this jutting lower jaw being the most famous one.
And it all came to a head in one man, King Charles II of Spain. His family tree wasn't really a tree. It was more like a tangled stump. His mother was his father's niece. His grandmother was also his aunt. Generations of this meant that, genetically speaking, his inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister.
The results were just horrific. Charles, who is known as the Bewitched, was basically a walking catalog of genetic disorders. His jaw was so deformed he couldn't chew his food properly. He just swallowed meals whole. He couldn't speak clearly until he was 4, or walk until he was 8. He was impotent, suffered from seizures, and was just plagued by constant illness his entire life. This was the king of a global empire, and he was physically shattered. His death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, and the autopsy report, wow. It's one of the most grim documents in royal history. It described a heart the size of a peppercorn, corroded lungs, and most shockingly, a single testicle as black as coal, and a head full of water. It's just a tragic, graphic end to a dynasty that literally destroyed itself from within.
All right, from the truly tragic, let's pivot to the truly absurd. What happens when a ruler with absolute power has a very, very small problem? Well, you get a symphony of pettiness, where the tiniest little slights lead to some of the most bizarre overreactions in all of history.
So first up, we have Xerxes the Great, the powerful king of Persia. While he was invading Greece, he built these incredible pontoon bridges across a strait called the Hellespont. But then a storm rolled in and just destroyed all his hard work. A normal leader might be frustrated, right? Xerxes was personally offended by the weather.
He didn't just order new bridges. Oh no, he ordered the sea itself to be punished. His soldiers were commanded to whip the water 300 times while shouting this curse at it, calling it a turbid and briny river and accusing it of wronging him. He even had shackles thrown into the water to enslave it. I mean, you have to be on another level of power to declare war on H2O.
But if you think that's petty, let's travel over to 18th century Russia and meet Tsar Peter III. Peter was, to put it gently, a pretty immature ruler who was still playing with his toy soldiers well into adulthood. And he took his games very, very seriously.
So what do you do when a rat gets into your bedroom and chews the head off one of your favorite toy soldiers? Well, if you're Peter III, you apply the full force of the law. He had the rat arrested, put it on trial for treason, found it guilty, and then had a tiny little gallows built to carry out the execution. And remember, this was the man in charge of the entire Russian Empire.
For our final story, we're going to slow things down. This isn't about excess or pettiness. This is a tale of forbidden love, a brutal murder, and a revenge so bizarre and macabre it has echoed through centuries as one of history's most haunting love stories.
It all begins in 14th century Portugal. You have Prince Pedro, who's in a political marriage, but he falls completely in love with his wife's lady-in-waiting, a woman named Inés de Castro. After his wife dies, Pedro secretly marries Inés, going against his father, King Afonso, who saw their relationship as a huge political threat. The king decided the only way to solve this problem was to eliminate it permanently.
What happened next was just sheer brutality. King Afonso sent 3 assassins. They waited until Prince Pedro was away on a hunting trip, went into the monastery where Inés was living, and stabbed her to death right in front of her terrified children. Pedro came back to find the love of his life murdered on his own father's orders.
The logic behind the murder was just cold and political. The story goes that Inés pleaded for her life at the king's feet, surrounded by his own grandchildren. For a second, he actually hesitated, but his advisors pushed him, warning him about civil war. And finally, King Afonso just washed his hands of it with 4 chilling words: "Do whatever you want." He sealed her fate.
2 years later, King Afonso died, and Pedro took the throne. His first order of business was vengeance. He hunted down 2 of the assassins and, in this gruesome public display, had their hearts ripped out while they were still alive. But that wasn't enough. He then ordered Inés's body to be exhumed, dressed in royal robes, and placed on a throne right next to his. He declared her his one true queen and forced the entire nobility of Portugal to file past her corpse and kiss her decaying hand as a sign of their loyalty.
The decadence of Bertie, the tragedy of Charles, the pettiness of Xerxes, the obsessive love of Pedro. These weren't just personal stories. They were flaws that shaped nations and defined whole eras. It makes you wonder, right? When future generations look back at our time, which of our strange habits, our public dramas, and our leaders' quirks will be the ones that stand out as the defining manias of our age?